Red Stockings all will toss the ball and shout our loud hurrah. Hurrah, hurrah, for the noble game, hurrah. Red Stockings all will toss the ball and shout our loud hurrah.
In 1869, Cincinnati, a city known for pork packing and manufacturing, and its new suspension bridge, was to take a step that would put the Queen City in the history books, not for commerce, but for baseball. During the summer of 1868, the citizens of Cincinnati had been treated to an excellent display of the new pastime. The 1868 Cincinnati RedStockings enjoyed a great success, but fell a bit short of challenging the best teams, the powerhouse clubs of New York, Philadelphia, and Washington. Nonetheless, the enthusiasm for the new sport was at an all-time high in the Queen City, and at a downtown law office, the directors of the baseball club, led by their persuasive young president, Aaron Champion, decided on a bold venture. All the players on the 1869 team would be paid a salary and guaranteed contracts for a full season. 10 ballists were engaged for 1869 and paid sums ranging from $600 to $2,000, roughly 2 to 7 times the average worker's wage. The group of well-muscled, well-mustachioed, and well-trained young men became the first professional sports team in America and forever earned for Cincinnati the honor, the birthplace of professional baseball. Hi, everybody. This is the story of baseball's most important and historic team, the trailblazing RedStockings of 1869 and 1870. A team so good it would win 81 games in a row and then quickly become the model for the professional teams of the future. And yet, surprisingly, it only survived 2 seasons as it would become a victim of its own success. Risky business, this all-professional experiment. But the young idealist and club president, a lawyer by the name of Aaron Champion, felt that by paying players, he could help save the very young game of baseball from gambling and other vices, the very kinds of activities that threaten the integrity and popularity of the game. Baseball author and historian Darrell Brock explains.
He wanted baseball to succeed as a profession because he believed, A, that if you paid players, they wouldn't be so susceptible to gamblers. And you could have baseball as an honest game. And maybe it's worthwhile pointing out here that baseball had come to be regarded by many people as about the way, I don't know, maybe the status of mud wrestling or tractor pulling now or roller derby, as not a legitimate sport. And most like roller derby or professional wrestling, something that really wasn't on the up and up, and something that many families in those times didn't want to come out and see, didn't want to bring women and children out to see these ruffians. Champion was trying to make it legitimate, honest, and attractive. The same things that many ballparks are doing today to try to cut the drinking, cut the hooliganism, and get families out there.
Champion hoped to bring the best players in America to his new professional club in Cincinnati, but several spurned his offers. He finally put together, though, an interesting collection of veterans, a couple of all-stars, and several young, promising players.
There's a myth that the RedStockings went around the country buying up the best players for this club, but that never really happened. Most of the players on that '69 team were experienced ballists. That's what they were called then. But there were question marks. No one would have predicted such greatness from their lineup. Now, the first place Aaron Champion looked to try to put that 1869 team together was at his 1868 squad. And the first player he turned to was his manager and center fielder, Harry Wright. Wright had come to Cincinnati from New York in 1865 to manage a cricket club. He was well respected in the sporting circles back east, and he helped Champion evaluate and recruit players. Harry was a great baseball man, but more significantly, he had great family connections, for he was able to lure his younger brother, George, to Cincinnati. Now, George was the best shortstop in baseball and the heaviest hitter. By far and away, the best player of his era, the best shortstop of the 19th century. Harry turned to his own 1868 squad for his pitcher, the eccentric Asa Brainerd, a handsome, hard-drinking, hard-throwing pitcher. And don't forget that in this era, pitching was underhand, fast pitch from 45 feet, just like fast pitch softball is today. The pitching wasn't so hard on the arm, and teams only carried one full-time hurler. 3 other players were held over from the 1868 squad. Third baseman Fred Waterman, an excellent fielder, a strong hitter, and a very popular player. He later opened a successful cigar store in Cincinnati, capitalizing on his Red Stockings fame. Catcher Doug Allison also came from the '68 Reds. Allison was a question mark, though. This would be his first full season as a catcher, but he had shown a lot of toughness. And when you're catching without a glove and with no protective equipment, at the least, you'd better be tough. Harry also kept Charlie Gould, the only native Cincinnatian, and the tall first baseman with the nickname Bushel Basket, because he was so adept at harvesting all the throws and ground balls that came his way. Harry then turned to another Cincinnati club, the Buckeyes, and signed second baseman Charlie Swayze, who was a good fielder and who would show surprising power at the plate. But Charlie also had a reputation for laziness and for drinking, and Harry knew he would have his hands full. Harry also picked Andy Leonard from the Buckeyes. Leonard was probably the fastest runner on the club, an excellent fielder, and one of the best singers on the 9. Don't forget they took a lot of long train trips in that era, and singing was a popular way to pass the time. The last player that Harry and Champion recruited for the team was a real toss of the dice, Cal McVeigh, an 18-year-old outfielder from a second-rate club in Indianapolis. Now, Harry had seen McVeigh play on occasion and took a chance on this powerful youngster. Excellent choice as it turned out, for McVeigh quickly established himself as an excellent hitter and a versatile fielder, even filling in for the catcher Allison when Allison was hurt.
On those breezy afternoons of April and May in 1869, Harry Wright gathered his new club at the Red Stockings ballpark. Since he was paying them, he could make them show up and he could make them stay in shape. And as a result, those practice sessions would create the very first Big Red Machine.
As individuals, these players may not each have been an all-star at his position, with the exception of George Wright, who was beyond question an all-star, an all-time all-star. But what Harry Wright did was to mold them into a team, playing team ball in a way that no one had seen up to that time. They would hit behind the runner to move him from first. They would, there were 2 captains on the field, basically. Allison, a catcher, was calling signals for the infield. George at short for the outfield, directing traffic. Because you had to catch a ball barehanded, for example, and because the ball had more give, it was more elastic than today's ball, although it was about the same size, bouncing out of bare hands was a common occurrence. What one player would do would call for who was to take the ball and who else was to kneel nearby, if time permitted, to watch for the bounce, you know, to dive for it if that would happen. Harry also had a system of relays, of backup plays, of pickoff plays, very modern, very, very modern. So this, as a team, they brought a kind of baseball to the country that had never been seen before. Ball players, not being stupid, were quick to pick up on this, and the next year the competition became much stiffer. But the Red Stockings in 1869 were way ahead.
The team won a few games at home in April and May, but locally there just really wasn't a whole lot of significant competition, so the club went on the road. In June, the Red Stockings headed east and played the best clubs of New York, Philadelphia, and Washington. As far as he was concerned, this would be the true test of Aaron Champion's experiment. Trouble was, on the eve of their departure, the trip was almost canceled.
Now, you must remember that while this club had great success on the field, it always struggled financially. The club had hoped to realize some revenue from the early season games, but attendance was flat, and then the last game before the road trip was rained out. No rain checks in 1869, so all the money had to be refunded. Now, the officers of the club are in a frenzy. They didn't have enough money to buy the train tickets. It was Memorial Day weekend, the banks were closed. Finally, one of the club members volunteered his wife's savings of $300 to bankroll the trip. When they boarded the train that morning on May 31st, 1869 to head east, they had just $24 left in cash, tickets only as far as Boston, 24 bats, 12 balls, 1 bottle of liniment, And a couple of the players, in Champion's words, had touched the Rosie a little too freely the night before and were hungover. What an unlikely start to a trip that would eventually put the RedStockings in the history books.
The financial problems temporarily solved, the RedStockings arrived in New York City on June 15th to face the mighty New York Mutuals. Harry and the boys had won the first 10 games of the road trip, and all of New York was now buzzing over these upstarts from the West. An early morning shower left the air cool and kept some fans away, but over 6,000 traveled to the ballpark. Most games of this era were high scoring, but the excellent fielding and pitching of both clubs kept the score low, and the RedStockings rallied in the 9th inning for a 4-2 win. The game was immediately hailed as the greatest ever. For the book, The First Boys of Summer, co-author John Urardi, who was a columnist for the Cincinnati Enquirer, went back in time to write columns about the significant events from the 1869 season, including that mutual victory.
I have never seen a spectacle as palpitating as the RedStockings' 4-2 victory over the New York Mutuals here yesterday afternoon. It is the greatest game of all time being the 22 years since Alexander Cartwright laid out the first diamond at the Elysian Fields in Hoboken, New Jersey. The RedStockings will make baseball rise like a hot air balloon. Just think how high it will go if the RedStockings beat the Brooklyn Atlantics today and the Philadelphia Athletics next week. They may be all that stands between Harry's boys and an undefeated tour. Jules Verne will put them on the moon. And what happened then is that the RedStockings defeated everybody else on their schedule, the New York clubs and the Philly clubs. And those games were played in front of some very tough crowds. Then they went to Washington, knocked off the best DC clubs, even got an audience with the president. That was President Ulysses S. Grant. And they were probably the first sports team to be honored that way. They played 20 games on the road, won them all, and when they returned, they were not only heroes in Cincinnati, they were national heroes as well.
The train carrying the RedStockings pulled into the depot at 10 a.m. on July 1st, and the team was greeted by city leaders and some 4,000 admirers. The boys climbed into wagons and carriages and, led by a band, paraded through downtown streets. An Enquirer reporter described a scene of excitement such as Cincinnati had seldom witnessed. Later that afternoon, prior to an exhibition game on the home field, the team was presented with a trophy, a 27-foot-long, 1,600-pound bat inscribed with the names of all the players. Harry Wright thanked the local lumber company for the gift, but admitted he really couldn't get the swing of it. The RedStockings were hailed nationally as well, their pictures appearing in the illustrated news magazines Harper's Weekly and Leslie's Illustrated News, the time in Newsweek of the era. The boys had become the first national sports heroes, their images and exploits carried from coast to coast. The club spent the better part of July and August at home, defeating their opposition easily, but they had two scares. In mid-July, the Forest City Club of Rockford, Illinois visited Union Grounds in Cincinnati and surprised everybody by taking a 14-12 lead in the 9th inning. The Reds stepped to the bat in the 9th with the winning streak on the line, and here's correspondent Urardi's report.
When the RedStockings trailed yesterday 14-12 with only 2 outs to go, most spectators believed the winning streak was headed the way of the keelboat. But Harry struck a hot grounder to left off Rockford's 19-year-old pitcher, Albert Spaulding. He then advanced to third on a hit by Andy Leonard and stole home. He even flashed the steal sign beforehand, so batsman Asa Brainerd would know he was coming. Had Harry not made it, all of the coal would have been out of his boys' boilers. And how about Asa? He followed Harry and Andy with a hit of his own, then scored the winning run. We've written less than kind things about you before, Podner. We take none of it back now. But pin this rosebud to your lapel. Whiskey cools your gullet, but ice water courses your veins. Now that was a tough-minded group of players. They won most of their games by big scores. They even made it look easy. But you know, they had several close games that season. They won that big one in New York against the Mutuals in the 9th, and then he pulled out this one in the 9th with 3 runs. Asa Brainerd, what a character he was. But when the game was on the line, he'd just chew on that toothpick a little bit harder, and he'd come up with that big hit.
In August, probably the biggest and most anticipated game of the season was scheduled for Cincinnati's Union grounds. The notorious Haymakers of Troy, New York visited the city, and as a result, excursion trains were bringing in fans from all over the area. The Haymakers had a reputation for not only being rough and tumble, but also for letting gamblers get in on the action, so this was a game that everybody wanted to see, and as a result, over 10,000 showed up at a ballpark that was considered one of the finest in the country.
Union Grounds, the RedStockings ballpark, was located in the city's west end, where another famous landmark, Union Terminal, now the Museum Center, stands today. Union Grounds was a magnificent facility for its time and quite an investment for the club to make. Most teams played on open fields with no stands or fences. The RedStockings played on many fields where the best seats were up in the trees or perched on the back of a wagon. But Union Grounds had a fence. The fence, by the way, was built not as a home run target, but simply as a barrier to keep out the non-paying customers. The fence was probably 400 feet or more down each foul line, far enough that no one ever hit a home run out of Union Ground. The grandstand behind home plate was called the Grand Duchess, which could seat about 4,000. And for a big game like the Haymaker contest, the additional fans would stand in foul ground beyond first and third base. There was a clubhouse just beyond third base, which was reserved for the members of the club. Think of it as the first luxury box. Food was served before, during, and after the game, and members could stand out on the veranda and watch the play on the field below. You would also see carriages parked on the field. If you were a person of some means, you would drive to the game in your own carriage and park it inside the grounds up against the outfield fence. And fair balls hit under the carriages were in play. Outfielders would have to crawl under the carriages to dig out the ball. The main grandstand was reserved for ladies and their escorts. Attracting women to the game was very important in helping establish a wholesome reputation for baseball. Having women present was seen as a civilizing force on both the crowd and on the players. It kept the drinking and hooliganism under control, and the newspapers would always report on the number of ladies in the crowd.
Game day was something. There was a procession. There were, thousands of people poured out there, and millions of dollars flooded into Cincinnati because of this. It really was the sporting capital of the world, and it was quite a pageant on a game day. I don't think we can imagine the excitement now that was felt then, because we're so saturated with media. The opposing ball players are familiar to us long before they showed up. But when the New Yorks appeared, coming through the double gates, or came in their omnibus with their pennants flying and their singing their club song and their music playing, wearing their colors, and you knew they were from, they were the Brooklyn Boys or the Rockford, Illinois champions. Really unbelievable excitement. Crowds of boys running and yelling, maybe throwing an occasional stone at them, and a procession of carriages coming in through the carriage gates, and an enormous fashion show going on as women in full regalia, a silk jungle, would go up to the Grand Duchess where they would go with their escorts. It was reserved for ladies and escorts. And the band would be playing. The Zouave band would be playing atop the Grand Duchess, sentimental songs maybe, like My Johnny Was a Soldier, and they would wave handkerchiefs and banners, and during exciting plays, men would throw their derbies and their canes and their scorecards, and a wonderful scene. Just truly wonderful. Vendors hawking. There was, I would give anything to go back in time and be able to see a game at the Union Grounds.
If you would have gone back in time to the Haymakers game of August 26, you would have seen the most controversial contest of the season. With the score tied at 17-17 in the 6th inning, the Haymakers disputed a call by the umpire and stalked off the field. The umpire declared a forfeit and awarded the game to the RedStockings. Here's correspondent Arardi.
The RedStockings have done nothing to besmirch the national pastime. But you know what they say about sleeping with swine? It is time to clean up the game. Yesterday at the Union Grounds, the Haymakers walked off the field in the 6th inning. The score was tied at 17, and the Haymakers' bets were at risk. No surprise there. It is rumored that 2 days before the game, one of the Red Stockings was approached by a gambler from Troy, New York. The Haymakers must be turned into baseball's National Judiciary Committee and, according to the rules, be liable for suspension from the National Association for 1 year. No official action was ever taken by the National Association. The umpire's ruling stood and was a victory for the Red Stockings. Some accounts even say the boys tied this game, but officially their winning streak had reached 40 games.
In September, the fame of the Red Stockings and their value as performers had grown to the point where they received an invitation to travel all the way to San Francisco on the new Transcontinental Railroad to play the top California clubs.
The road trip took 33 days, and it made the Red Stockings the first team ever to travel coast to coast in one season. Even though they arrived in San Francisco at 11 o'clock at night, they were greeted by 2,000 people who'd come to see the most famous team of all time. Now, the boys easily defeated the Frisco clubs, winning by an average score of 56-6, I think. They took in some sightseeing, but grew homesick. They complained about the cold, windy weather. In fact, their complaints about playing conditions sound like modern players talking about Candlestick Park today.
Back home, the Red Stockings ran their winning streak to 56 games. The final game of the season was in early November at home, a return match against the powerful New York Mutuals. The Red Stockings took an early lead and won easily, 17-8.
Vini, Vidi, Vici. Such is the way Harry signed the last page of the scorebook, in which he tallied all 57 of the Red Stockings' victories this season, against no losses. We came, we saw, we conquered. How did they win them all, especially the close ones? Harry was ahead of his competitors, that's how. The New York and Philly clubs have players as good as the Red Stockings, except for George Wright, of course. Nobody has a player as good as George Wright. But Philly and New York didn't field as crisply, communicate as concisely, or cavort as cohesively. To the west, the Chicago citizens say they'll spend whatever it takes to topple the Cincinnatis. Because of the Red Stockings' success, every city worth its salt pork will field professional nines. But 57-0, you'll never see a record like that again, no matter what color your stockings. Savor the season, Porkopolitans.
The Reds would finish up 57-0 for this season. Not only was it a perfect record, but listen to some of these statistics. An average of 42 runs a game. In fact, in one game, they scored 103 runs. And on top of that, now remember, this is 1869. They traveled some 12,000 miles, and they played to over 200,000 fans. It all simply proved that Aaron Champion was right. Not only was it a superior professional game, but from coast to coast, the crowds loved baseball. In early December, the club announced it had re-signed the entire club for the following year. Everybody in Cincinnati loved the idea, but what a difference a year can make.
It was impossible to predict or imagine at the beginning of the 1870 season that this team, which had enjoyed such greatness in 1869, would literally fall apart. Some of the signs were there. The team still struggled financially. They had to borrow about $2,000 to begin the season. The club decided also to raise ticket prices from 25 cents to 50 cents to create more income, but this caused some grumbling among the fans. Then, in an early game, Allison dislocated a thumb, the first of several key injuries that were to decimate the club. Nonetheless, the club had stretched its winning streak to 80 straight games when it ran up against the Brooklyn Atlantics in Brooklyn on June 14th. A huge crowd surrounded the field and watched the new Atlantics pitcher Zeitlin keep the Red Stockings off balance. The score was tied 5-5 in the 11th inning when the Reds scored 2 runs and appeared to have won the game. But the Atlantics came back and scored 3, and the winning streak was over.
There are scribes touting this as the finest game ever played, but it wasn't the finest game the Red Stockings ever played. There was a 2-base overthrow by Fred Waterman. There were 2 hard shots off Atlantic bats that twisted Waterman and Charlie Sweezy into pretzels. A muff by Doug Allison on a great throw home from Cal McVeigh, and finally Sweezy's fateful muff in the 11th that allowed the winning run to score. There are 6 of the Atlantic's 8 runs. Maybe the standard of invincibility to which the Red Stockings were held finally got the best of them. What other explanation is there? There has never been a better fielding 9. But you wouldn't have known that yesterday. Some of the boys would have dropped a sleeping baby from their grasp. After sending a telegram back to Cincinnati and maintaining a stiff upper lip, Aaron Champion went back to his hotel room and wept. There is no shame in that, nor in the loss. The Reds played hard. The tears will dry. Today is another game. Sure enough, the RedStockings rebounded. They won the rest of their games on that road trip, and they returned to Cincinnati with the best record among all the top clubs in America. But what happened is that the loss destroyed their invincibility, and in July and August, the problems started to mount.
On July 20th, the RedStockings hosted the Harvard College 9 and barely escaped with a victory, coming from 5 runs down in the 9th inning. Despite the comeback, the newspapers criticized the players for their lazy antics and suggested the club had better reduce ticket prices back to 25 cents if they expected the public to watch such inferior performances. And then 1 week later, the boys hosted the Athletics of Philadelphia, and the impossible happened. For the first time in 2 years, the RedStockings lost a home game.
Is it the recent heat wave which has swelled the heads of our RedStockings to the size of Indiana melons? I don't know, but I know this. With their willow and ash, the Athletics exploded our melon heads all over Union grounds yesterday. Something cancerous is at work between the members of the 9 and the public which worships them. We do not know what the future holds for the RedStockings, but the Porcopolitan public is not going to continue to turn out and pay 4 bits for something as disgusting as these recent displays, and that includes yesterday's. We single out Allison, Asa Brainerd, and Charlie Sweezy for their boneheaded plays. We suggest to Champion they be the first to go the way of the 50-cent admission price if they can't do more honor than this to the Scarlet Hose. This loss was followed by the surprise resignation of the team's president, Aaron Champion. He said he just wanted to spend more time with his law practice, but what I think happened was he knew the team was starting to unravel. He wanted out. The players were jealous of the Wright brothers and the money they made and the star treatment they got. Perhaps Champion even saw Harry starting to lose control of his team.
In August, 2 more off-field episodes far outshadowed their success on the field. On August 9th, George Wright suffered a severe knee injury, and the star shortstop was effectively put on the shelf for the rest of the season.
What happened is that George probably sprained or tore a ligament in his knee. He came back for the last few games that season, but he was nowhere near 100%. Without him, the RedStockings were just ordinary. They lost 6 games that season, and in those 6, George missed or played lame in 5 of them.
The second episode, which disrupted the team, happened in Portsmouth, Ohio, just upriver from Cincinnati. The RedStockings went there on an overnight steamboat to play the Riverside. It's a pretty mediocre club. But with George Wright injured and the other boys continuing their lackadaisical play, the Riversides took a surprising 5-run lead into the 9th inning. There were 2 out for the RedStockings. Looked like they were about to suffer this very embarrassing defeat. But then a rally. A couple of hits, a couple of errors. The Reds scored 2 runs and have 2 on. Andy Leonard then hits a short fly ball that the left fielder reaches in and catches, and the Reds have lost. But wait, Harry Wright, who was on second base, believes that the left fielder had trapped the ball. He appeals to the umpire, and in the tradition of the day, the umpire asks the left fielder if he caught it. No, he says, I must admit I caught it on the bounce. Well, the umpire then sends Leonard to first base. The bases are now loaded. The Reds, with 2 out, 3 runs down, Charlie Swayze steps up and hits a grand slam home run. The Reds win by 1 run. What a finish. Now, Swayze must have celebrated a little too much on the boat ride home, however, for there is a fight or 2, a brawl. Swayze's in the middle of everything. The captain even threatens to run the boat ashore and make the boys walk home. But in the end, the club expelled Swayze, although it quickly reinstated him. But the whole episode seemed to mock everything the RedStockings had stood for: high standards, team discipline, and this was another sign the club was in serious trouble.
The Cincinnati RedStockings would end the season in early November. Their record for 1870, 68 wins, 6 losses, and 1 tie. Now, for anybody else, that would be an incredible year, but for Cincinnati fans, It was kind of a letdown. After all, the year before, they had had a perfect season. And you could see the letdown at the gate. Attendance was down, and some fans stayed away simply because the ticket prices had gone up. In fact, the RedStockings drew better on the road than they did at home. And then, of course, there was a press, even then, critical of some of the players. One column said some loved whiskey unwisely and some were intolerably conceited. So with all this, as the club began booking the season for 1871, it had to make some tough choices. Choices that sound familiar today.
So faced with declining revenues and with several of the players wanting more money in 1871, the club decided they simply could not afford professional baseball. Aaron Champion estimated it would cost $17,000 in 1871 to put a first-class team on the field. The club members decided that with their ticket sales off, and that was their only source of revenues, that they simply could not afford it. In fact, one of the club members said in a statement that sounds like it could come out of yesterday's paper, he said, "Baseball doesn't pay as it used to." And so the club decided to play in 1871 with only amateur players. The press blasted the decision of the club. The commercial ran a rare front-page editorial cartoon that featured 9 fat, slovenly-looking ball players that represented an amateur team and said amateur ball would never succeed in Cincinnati. In a few days, Harry Wright announced he was moving to Boston to start a new team, and he took several of the best players with him, including his brother George. He also took the idea of the RedStockings with him, the color red, and his new team in Boston was called the Boston Red Sox. Several of the other players signed on with the Washington, D.C. club.
Goodbye, RedStockings. The romance between you and the city which spawned you as the best, most celebrated nine in the land was a glorious one at its zenith. But as with so many love-at-first-sight relationships, it drew a fast flame. Melancholy shall grip some of us for a while, though we recognize that for the players, romance is nothing but a memory on the way to the next port of call. Our special thanks go to Harry. Without him, the glory that was the RedStockings never would have been. May the wind always be at your back, old vet. George keeps smiling, Cal keeps swinging, Andy keeps singing, Fred keep chewing, Doug keeps strutting. Charlie Gould, get some Beantown grease on that goatee quickly. Asa and Sweezy, rosebuds and plenty of rosy for you both. Viel Glück, our German friends say. Good luck.
The team would disband and the players would scatter, but most would continue to play the game for the next 10 years. And of course, the biggest names would be George and Harry Wright, and both of them are in the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown today. As for baseball in Cincinnati, well, it recovered quite nicely, thank you. Professional ball would come back in 1876 when the Reds would become charter members of the new National League. And since then, the tradition has grown to a grand scale with names like Roush and Groh in 1919, the championship teams of 1939 and 1940, the slugging Redlegs of the 50s and the 60s, and of course, the big red machine of the 1970s.
All can trace their roots back to the glorious season of 1869, when the boys in the RedStockings ruled the green turfs from New York to San Francisco and forever changed the game of baseball. The first boys of summer.
We are a band of baseball players from Cincinnati City. We come to toss the ball around and sing to you our ditty. And if you listen to our song we are about to sing, we'll tell you all about baseball and make the welcome ring. Hurrah, hurrah, for the noble game, hurrah. RedStockings all will toss the ball and shout our loud hurrah. Hurrah, hurrah, for the noble game, hurrah. RedStockings all will toss the ball and shout our loud hurrah!